recording. Uh, so we do have a lot of material we're going to be covering this week, getting you ready for the United Nations project that we're going to come right into after Thanksgiving break. So just a reminder, if you haven't already, you should go ahead and look and see what country you've been assigned to. That is on Canvas. I made an announcement. I also believe I sent a message to everybody. So you want to open up that file to see what country you've been assigned to. I know there were a couple um, errors along the way, but hopefully I've been able to resolve those. But I don't think anybody had any duplicates. So just a reminder, you only should be uh, assigned one country. And hopefully you've been able to get step one done of that assignment. The report itself will probably you'll be able to complete the report a little easier after our lecture on Thursday, because Thursday we're really going to spend most of class talking about the structure of the United Nations specifically. So if you're still kind of stuck on how the United Nations works and operates, we'll get a lot more information on Thursday. I did have a couple people asking about if we're going to be turning in stuff every week for this. There isn't anything that you're required to turn in each week. My assumption is that you'll be able to get all the steps done and have everything turned in by the due date, and you'll just turn it in one big batch. But if you are concerned or want me to take a look at what you've got so far, don't hesitate to send me an email or a Canvas message with your document. I believe if you submit it through Google Assignments, if I go and look through it and return it to you, you'll be able to make edits. But I'm not 100% certain on that. But the easiest, probably the best way for you would just be send me an email with what you've worked on so far, if you want me to take a look at it to make sure you're on the right path. But other than that, just make sure you'll have everything turned in, the report itself on December 6th, and then we will do the debate and discussion with your country the week after Thanksgiving. So you'll get all Thanksgiving week to work on your assignments or on your project. The other thing, just a reminder that we are not doing any starters for virtual classes. So we should be on, if I double check, let me see on the field journal, like we should be starting with 4.6 and 4.7 today. You won't have to put a starter in for that section, but once we come back to in-person learning on Thursday, there will be a starter, and I'll be making sure to record that lecture for those of you who are traditionally distance learners, so you can get that starter. But today, all you need to do for your field journal is put your notes in after today into the 4.6, 4.7, which is tab D as in Delta. With that, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. We're moving on. We're going to finish up our gerrymandering discussion and topic from last week, and then we're going to move into political ideologies and different forms of governance. So you'll want to make sure you get your notes out, ready to write down the information. Another reminder too, I am hosting an AP skills seminar, which will be on Tuesday. So starting today, it will be on Zoom starting at 2:45. If you just come to the Zoom room, I'll let you in. It's an hour long, but basically we focus on not necessarily the content in AP geography, but more so the skills. So like we'll be looking at past AP tests, previous FRQs and multiple choice questions and diving deep into those. Also focus on a little bit about specific study habits, stuff like that. If you're interested in coming to that, you're more than welcome to just pop in at 2:45. You don't necessarily have to stay for the entire hour. It's not required for the course, but it's more so just for your benefit. And if you seem like you're struggling with maybe the first two exams we've taken, if you didn't get really high score and you want to work on improving that, definitely look into coming starting today at 2:45. But that will just be the same Zoom link that you use to get to here. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started for today. Once again, as always, if you have any questions or concerns, you're more than welcome to just pop in. And I'm going to go ahead and get us here. Okay, so last week we started talking about gerrymandering. See if I get that minimized. There we go. Start talking about gerrymandering. And remember, with gerrymandering, we're talking about how, specifically here in the United States, when we're talking about internal voting districts within a country, specifically the United States, how those voting districts are determined at the congressional level. And usually, depending on how the state is set up, the party in control, the majority party of the legislature, gets to dictate where congressional boundaries um, are located. And just how the majority party in control can really reformat and redistrict the congressional district to get as many voters who are solid for that party. So, for example, if you have a state legislature that is majority Republican, you have congressional districts that are drawn to take up the most amount of Republican voters. Similarly, if you have a Democratic legislature, you can have a legislature that is primarily trying to create districts that that encompass the majority Democratic voters. So that way, you can kind of really solidify that party's control in Congress. So once again, I'm just showing the slide so that those of you who maybe weren't here last week or didn't get a chance to write down, this is one of the definitions that I believe is in your field journal, and it's something that you want to make sure you understand what it means to gerrymander. And we're going to take a look at some actual examples, current and past examples of gerrymandering in a second. So I'll just give you just a minute here to write down this definition if you haven't gotten it already. While you're writing that down, just with gerrymandering, it's a process that, once again, that both parties have been guilty of and are currently guilty of. This isn't, even though we see a bit more gerrymandering when it comes to Republican-held legislatures, that's not to say that Democrats aren't guilty as well with gerrymandering. It's just a lot more prevalent and happens more often in Republican-led states. And we're going to look at examples of that in Republican states and also in Democratic states. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on. So we ended last week specifically looking at Utah's congressional districts and how I kind of threw out the question whether you guys thought that Utah's congressional districts were gerrymandered or not. And I think a couple of you guys said that it does look like they've been gerrymandered. And if you specifically look at Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City specifically, you can notice how basically each congressional district takes a cut of either Salt Lake County or the metropolitan area of Salt Lake. Now, why? So if we think about how Utah has set up its legislature, we know that Utah's majority party in the legislature has consistently been the Republican Party. Now, here in Utah, the congressional districts are set up by the legislature. So why do you think, or what would be an advantage to breaking up Salt Lake like this?
I think you were saying last time how Salt Lake is more Democrat, where everywhere else is generally Republican. So if everybody takes a bit of Salt Lake City, then you get a more split amount of Democrat versus Republican.
That's exactly right. You know, if we think about how Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County typically votes and say a presidential election or in local elections, typically we see more Democratic votes. Salt Lake County and Summit County typically are the only two counties in the state that in a presidential election will vote for the Democratic candidate, while the rest of the state, the rest of the counties will actually vote for the Republican candidate. So, I don't have the map with me right now, but if we looked at this presidential election this year between President-elect Biden and current President Donald Trump, we would see that Salt Lake County overwhelmingly went for Biden, and so did Summit County. But all of the rest of the counties of Utah went for Trump. And so some have argued or seen that Salt Lake County has been divided up the way that it is to make sure that Utah doesn't get a clear Democratic candidate or Democratic representative in Congress. Because if you can say have the second congressional district encompass half of Salt Lake County and half of Davis County, which a little more liberal, but then the rest of the voters in that district come from, say Tooele, Joab, Millard, Beaver, Iron, Washington counties, which are all Republican strongholds. That means that overwhelmingly that district is going to be Republican, even though it seems like there should be there's more Democratic voters in the metropolitan areas. The only exception to this is congressional district number 4. So if you guys remember this year, we had a very tight congressional race that was called yesterday between current Democrat Representative Ben McAdams and Republican challenger Burgess Owens. And in 2018, that district was in control by Mia Love, who's a Republican. But because of her voting record and just kind of the general attitudes towards the Republican Party in 2018, Ben McAdams was able to win that seat, number 4, by a margin of 700 votes. So it came down to 700 votes because that district encompasses most of the population of Salt Lake, in addition to half of Utah County, which is primarily Republican county, most of the inhabited part of Joab County, and same for Sanpete County, which all of those are Republican held, but there's just enough or Democratic voters or independent voters in Salt Lake County that it's more of a toss-up district. So with the current election, Burgess Owens has won by 2,000 votes. Ben McAdams conceded yesterday, so now all the representatives in Utah are Republican. And some could argue it's because of the way that the state's been gerrymandered, though there are some who argue that because of the way that congressional districts have to have at least 700,000 voters within them, some have argued that there's no real way to draw these boundaries without breaking up Salt Lake County because of our demographics and our population density, everything being along the Wasatch Front. It's kind of impossible to have, say, all of southern Utah, one congressional district, because there's not enough people to add up to 700,000. So we'll see. In the coming elections, we'll see how the demographics end up changing as Salt Lake becomes more and more diverse and more Democratic. Same with Utah County. We'll definitely probably see more opportunities, closer races, and higher chance for a Democratic candidate to take over. Now, let's look at an example of Democratic gerrymandering. So this is Chicago. So this is in the state of Illinois. Illinois has, I believe, 30 congressional districts throughout the state, but most of it is centered along the metropolitan area of Chicago. And if we know the state of Illinois, most of the urban area Illinois, where most of the population is primarily Democratic, while the rest of the state typically votes more Republican. And so the legislature in Illinois is Democratic. And you can see how some of these districts have been drawn up in favor of the Democratic Party. Now, these are actual congressional districts. As you can see, some of them, they look pretty normal, pretty average, but look at number 4 here. See how that district all of a sudden gets really narrow right here. and then widens up here. So what happened here is that the 4th congressional district here typically has more conservative Republican voters in it. And so they gerrymandered the district so that they could encompass more Democratic voters versus, say, the 7th district here, which all of this here are strong, 100% guaranteed Democratic voters primarily. And then as you see, as you get farther west, this is where it becomes a little bit more rural and Republican. And so like the 6th congressional district in Illinois is always a Republican seat, but all of these have been gerrymandered in favor of the Democratic Party. Now, probably asking, well, what would an ideal nonpartisan map look like? Well, we have some political scientists who have gone out with each state and tried to look up and see if there was a way to have a more representative congressional districting, and this is what they came up with for the state of Illinois. So if this were solely based off of population and not necessarily voting records, this is what it would look like. And we would most likely see more Republican seats given in this situation versus what it is currently, where there's more chances for Democrats. One really great example of gerrymandering happens in North Carolina. North Carolina's districting typically is controlled by the Republicans. And you can see how the Republicans have cut out these districts so that this district, yeah, they'll give to the Democrats the way that they've gerrymandered it, but then all the other districts can go for Republicans. It's guaranteed a Republican seat. But some of these districts are just crazy, just not normal at all. Just looking at how these are all drawn up. Once again, this is a great example of gerrymandering. North Carolina, and as we know, North Carolina was thought to be a swing state this past presidential election because even though it appears that most congressional representation from North Carolina comes from Republican Party, Republicans, the overall statewide demographics are swaying more towards Democratic, and that we have more of a chance of, say, a Democratic senator or Democratic president winning the state versus congressional representation. Let's take another example of a state that actually flipped and changed in 2020. So Georgia has always consistently been a very solid Republican state. No Democrat has won the state since I believe may have been it was Jimmy Carter in 1976. Since then, it's been strongly red, has voted and given its electoral votes for every Republican candidate since then. On the left, this is how it's currently drawn by the congressional districts. Now, what do you notice here? Why do you think, what's up here? Why is it blue up here? Anybody know?
Atlanta?
Exactly, Atlanta. So we know typically more urban areas, big urban development areas like Atlanta, typically are more liberal, more democratic, just because of diversity and the approaches to social issues. And so the Georgian legislature understood that, regardless, there's going to be Democratic representatives, but their end goal with gerrymandering is to prevent the most amount of Democratic representatives. So in this 2016 outcome, we saw that Georgia has 4 Democratic representatives and the remainder are all Republican. But then if you look at a non-gerrymandered actual equal dividing up of the state for congressional districts, you would notice that, in fact, the Democrats would pick up 2 additional seats if it were divided up in a nonpartisan way. And remember that Georgia actually flipped in favor of Joe Biden, President-elect Biden, this past election season because of the demographics changing in Georgia. And we're seeing more as Atlanta continues to grow and develop, and more parts of the state get more urban. We're seeing less of a Republican outcome, and more so of a Democratic outcome. So it'll be interesting to see if Georgia, if the state races in the legislature get more and more blue. We could definitely see Democrats taking over and control of the Georgia state legislature and potentially redrawing these districts for that they can gain more congressional representation. So this is probably one of the most odd, unique forms of gerrymandering. This one is in favor of the Republican Party. As you can see, it encompasses parts of Orlando, goes all the way up through Gainesville, up to Jacksonville. We're talking about 200 miles worth of congressional district. The way that they gerrymandered here is that they knew that these wider parts are solid Republican, and they knew that this one swath area over here has a good majority of Republican voters, and then up in this part of Jacksonville is Republican. And they ended up drawing this district. But you're probably wondering, well, is gerrymandering constitutionally allowed? And the Supreme Court ruled that this district right here in 2016 violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, saying that because the state was so blatantly, obviously drawing this district to favor the Republican Party, that they had to go back and redraw a nonpartisan version of this district. Florida is still in the process of redesigning this district. So there have been cases where the Supreme Court has stepped in and said, okay, this is just getting plain ridiculous. So this is plain ridiculous, but in the Supreme Court's mind, this districting is not ridiculous. Last example, California used to be a heavily gerrymandered state, especially in favor of the Democrats, because obviously California is typically a very strong blue state in the urban areas like the Bay Area, down in the Southern California. It's the state with the most congressional representation. But about, I think it was 10 years ago, they passed a law that made it gerrymandering basically illegal, and they created a nonpartisan commission that equally divided up the representation. So it used to be that California overwhelmingly had Democratic representatives, but after this non-partisan commission came up, they created new congressional districts in California where actually now this county here, San Bernardino County, it's the largest county in the United States. In this situation here, these were all Democratic representatives, even though there should have been more Republican representation in these more rural parts of California. With this new setup here, this new commission, we have the formulation of more equal playing field when it comes to congressional representation because of this nonpartisan example of congressional districting. Okay, so does anybody have any questions on gerrymandering, redistricting, internal boundaries, anything like that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Every time that we have an election, do they check the districts to make sure there wasn't that intense gerrymandering?
Well, yeah, so that's a great question. So obviously, House of Representatives is reelected every 2 years, but congressional districts are drawn every 10 years. So they're based off of the recent census. So next year, the states will start redistricting and resetting up congressional districts based off of the 2020 census. So actually, Utah will probably gain a congressional seat. But what will happen is usually if around the election season, if there's a heavily gerrymandered district like here in Florida, you'll see the minority party challenge this in court, and it really depends on what the makeup of the court is and if they consider this a pressing issue. So obviously in 2016, they felt that the Supreme Court felt that this was a blatant violation of the Constitution. So they ordered, I think it was about 2 months before the election, they had to redraw this district, which caused this district ended up going Democratic. because of the new makeup. They ended up having to include more of Orlando because Orlando is typically more of a Democratic stronghold in Florida. Um, but yeah, every 2 years, these definitely come into play. There's always court cases every 2 years challenging some of these absurd gerrymandered districts, but it really comes down to how recent the district was created and whether the courts feel it's an important issue. Um, so this past election cycle, there weren't really a lot of challenges to the districting in the court. I can't think of any cases. I think there was one district in Pennsylvania that had to get district or redesigned. That was after the primary election. But other than that, um, it's usually about every 10 years where this really comes into the court system. So we'll see a lot more of these cases in 2022.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Anybody else have any more questions about gerrymandering or internal boundaries specifically? So you guys all understand how internal structures of some countries work, especially like the United States, where we have state boundaries and how the states have a bit more power and say over the federal government. And then just making sure you understand the concept of gerrymandering, uh, why it's utilized, and what are some of the problems with gerrymandering. So if there's no additional questions on this section, we're going to go ahead and move on to kind of one of my favorite part of this unit is political ideologies and devolutionary factors. So we're getting into kind of the last um, few sections of this unit. So we're hoping to wrap up Unit 4 end of this week, and then we'll be able to do our United Nations project, and hopefully we'll test not the week after Thanksgiving, but the following week. So the week that the project's due, we'll have our Unit 4 test. But I think you guys will get more interest out of these sections because we really talk about stuff that's relevant to us today in the geopolitical world. So let's go ahead and get into it. So we have some definitions here that you want to make sure you record down. Ultimately, when it comes to the way the governments are structured around the world, we can talk about specifically like communist states, fascist states. We could talk about capitalist states versus socialist states, but ultimately they usually fit into two categories. We have what are known as unitary states and federal states. So a unitary state is a system of political organization in which most or all of the governing power resides in a centralized government, in contrast to a federal state. So unitary, some examples include North Korea, China, Russia, and the United Kingdom. I put asterisks because they need a little bit more explanation, because Russia claims to be a federal state, a federal government, but they're more so a unitary under the current form of government. But basically, when you think of a unitary government, think of there's either an individual or a branch that is all powerful, all governing over the rest of the territory. So say with North Korea and China, North Korea, we have Kim Jong-un, who is the supreme leader, the premier of North Korea. And basically, even though there's a legislature, there's different branches of government. Like there is a Politburo, which is a legislative branch. That's basically there for show, because ultimately it's what Kim Jong Un says, and that's an example of a unitary state, that he can pretty much order anything. Is the head of the complete country, and there's nothing really to check back against his powers. Same goes with China. China, we have the Premier Xi Jinping, or President Xi Jinping. He is the head of the Communist Party of China, which is the most powerful political entity in the country of China. And we'll look at how that structure looks like. But it's whenever you hear of unitary state, think of a top-down system, versus, say, the United States, which is an example of a federal state, which we'll look into. Now, some of you guys may be surprised to hear that the United Kingdom falls into this category. We don't often see United Kingdom with North Korea, China, and Russia. United Kingdom is different in the sense that they don't have three branches of the checks and balances of government. They have the monarchy, which has some overriding power. So Queen Elizabeth II has the ability to, say, wage war with other countries to be able to create treaties just by herself. And then the prime minister and the parliament is able to govern exclusively. There aren't really any constitutional courts or ways to check back against the parliament of the UK or the monarchy. So that's why we consider it a unitary state. So I'll just give you another second here to write down definitions. Now, these are just a few examples. There's plenty of other unitary states out there, like Cuba is a unitary state. Trying to think what's another unitary state out there. Saudi Arabia is a Unitarian state. The king of Saudi Arabia has pretty much absolute rule over the people of Saudi Arabia. Thailand is also a unitary state. So anytime you see where there's either one solid leader who can do anything in the country, or there's just one group of people. So in the example with the United Kingdom, the Parliament, that's going to be unitary form of government. And then we're going to get into federal a little bit later because we've already covered federal states a bit because we looked at how the United States is set up where power is more evenly distributed. So we'll come back to federal in a second, but let's look at some more subsections of unitarian form of government. Let's start with fascism. Fascism itself is kind of not relevant in the world, but just keep in mind that fascism is a political philosophy, movement, or regime that exalts nation and often race above the individual, and that stands for a centralized autocratic government headed by a dictatorial leader, severe economic and social regimentation, and forcible suppression of opposition. So fascism came about, as we saw in World War II, Part 1, came about in Italy under Mussolini. Mussolini was trying to think of a way to kind of unite the Italian peoples. And they said, okay, well, we're going to unite all these kind of sovereign, separate entities into one, and we're going to use nationality or unity through nationality, where you say, okay, well, I'm an Italian or I'm a German, and regardless of what part of the land I come from, I'm still identify with that nationality. And so Mussolini came up with this idea and really tested it out with Italy. But Hitler, meanwhile, he actually kind of morphed it into a more authoritarian style of government, especially Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf. He really talks about, you know, Italy's version of fascism and how the German people have a right to inherit land and come together. And under a fascist system, it's important to recognize that difference between, say, fascism and communism is that fascism still allows for an open capitalist market. It's just that there's more authority from the government over the people, laws, social issues, and there's, even though the government doesn't own companies or private interests, they heavily regulate and tax those companies and organizations. One thing with fascist government is that any type of opposition or revolt is usually stamped down with use of force. So at one point or another, Italy and Germany are the great examples of fascist governments in the past. During World War II, Japan was a form of fascism during the Japanese Empire. Austria, obviously being in very close connection with Germany for a while, was a fascist empire, but also into the 70s and 80s, Brazil and Chile became elected or had fascist rulers. In Chile, we had the ruthless dictator General Pinochet, who would, you know, who had very close aspirations with Hitler and really transformed the Chilean government and economy into a dictatorship, a fascist government. Um, Fortunately, Pinochet did not reign in power for too long, but under his reign of terror, um, tens of thousands of people were killed as opposition to the system, to the government. But fascism really doesn't exist today. Obviously, fascist movements exist all around the world. They're more tied with right wing extremism, and we'll talk about what it means to have right wing and left wing extremism because that sometimes can get jumbled up um, in the media and what you hear from politicians. So we'll talk about what it means to have extreme right wing, left wing in a second. So with fascism, we're talking about extremely authoritative government, but we have we still have a class system with the economy, so there's still inequality. There's wealthy people, there's poor people, um, and there's a lot more emphasis on kind of creating a pure race in fascism. Then we get to the opposite end of the spectrum. We still have an authoritative system, but we're now on the left side of the economy, and that comes to communism. So, communism is a political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production. So, if you guys understood with World War II, sometimes it can get, there can be false accusations that the Soviets and the Nazis were, hand in hand, great buddies. They loved each other, and in fact, fascists hated communists, communists hated fascists because they both competed in terms of how to approach um, the economy and the class system. Under communism, the Soviet Union, we'll look specifically at how the Soviet Union became about here in a second, but essentially we have ideology coming from the 1800s through Karl Marx, Fred Engels. They both created and authored the Communist Manifesto, which basically argued that the time of monarchy and capitalism is over, and that there was going to be a big revolt around the world because at this time when the Communist Manifesto was created in Germany, this was during the Industrial Revolution in Europe. A lot more people working in factories, but the working conditions were really horrible. There weren't any protections and no such concept or anything of a union. And so during this time in Germany, Karl Marx primarily came up with this idea that, instead of having just a few who are in control of all of the industry in a country or in an area, it should be given to the workers, that the people who are actually producing the goods, who are working in the factories, have a right to um, own that their production, the means of production, um, and they should all kind of communally share those resources. Obviously, there are flaws with communism, as with any of these ideologies, um, and we'll talk about specifically what ends up happening in communist countries and regimes, because it mirrors the reason that it gets confused with fascism is that it really mirrors this top-down system, where if you oppose anything in the government, um, you're going to be silenced one way or another. But some current and former communist states, so obviously the Soviet Union, so the USSR, Vietnam is a current communist state, North Korea, the People's Republic of China, it still classifies as communist, but it's kind of going away from communist and into a quasi fascist state. And then Afghanistan at one point was a communist state. Some others that were left off there, Cuba is still communist, and there's still a couple Latin American countries that practice communism. So the way that you identify a communist country is who owns the company, who owns the businesses in the country. Is it primarily owned by private people, by individuals, or does the government, does the state own the companies. And if you have most of the companies being owned by the government, good chance that you're in a communist country. Okay, so what are we talking about when it comes to political ideologies and where do they line up? How do we identify them? So we have what's known as the political compass. This is something that you'll spend a lot of time on if you take AP Government with Ms. Smith. Um, you look specifically at um, where, say, U.S. political parties line up here. But this is basically the way that political scientists can look at um, how somebody's political ideology is. So basically, with this compass, if we had more time with this unit, I'd actually have you guys take the political compass test, where you can actually find out where you are located on this compass. But you have on the y-axis, so up and down, you have authoritarian and libertarian. This is in the sense of social control. So when it comes to the government being involved in, say, morality. So say if a government prohibited abortion or encouraged or required abortion, that would be authoritarian. While libertarian, think about Ron Swanson there. Libertarian believes more that the government shouldn't be involved at all when it comes to morality or any type of that questioning. Um, and so, like a libertarian, a pure libertarian would say that I have the right to own as many guns as I want. The government can't tell me how many guns I own. The government has no right to tell me who I can marry or love. The government has no right to tell me whether I can get an abortion or not. Versus an authoritarian who would say the government needs to regulate morality, that abortion is morally wrong, so the government should outlaw it, or that an authoritarian would say that the government has a right to prohibit or limit the ownership of arms or property, even. Then you get to what's known as the economic right and left. And economic right is going to be more capitalism and more freedom in the economy. So if you are saying that companies and businesses have every right to do whatever they please, no interference from the government, there shouldn't even be any taxation, you're going to be right down here. You're going to be in the libertarian right, and this is where most U.S. libertarians reside because they're very much about an open, free economy. You can have a libertarian left who's saying, okay, uh, I get to own as many guns as I want, but I definitely think that companies like oil companies should have environmental safeguards in place, or we should limit how much money somebody could make. Those would be people who are on the economic left. So to give you a sense of who would be here on the right, if you know Rand Paul, any of the libertarian candidates here in the U.S., so Joe Jorgensen, who ran in this presidential election, they would all be right down here. People who would be down here, think of Gandhi, would be down here. Bernie Sanders would be probably about right here. Then we get to up here. So the authoritarian right was where most Democrats and Republicans reside. So Republicans are going to be kind of up here, um, even though there's an advocacy in the Republican platform for, say, more rights and abilities. Um, there's more emphasis on regulating morality in the Republican Party. And so that's what brings them up to more authoritarian. And Republicans are more advocates of freer, open economy. Joe Biden, for example, and Barack Obama would be about right down here. Uh, they obviously believe in a capitalist society, but a bit more regulation on the capitalist society. Um, and also a bit more freer when it comes to morality. So, say, allowing abortions or the right to choose to have an abortion, but at the same time, Democratic Party says, well, we should regulate what type of guns are sold and how many, what types of weapons can be bought and sold in the U.S. There has to be some type of regulation. Right up here, if you're way up in this top up here and kind of, let's say about right above the green screen sharing part, that's where Hitler would be. very strong authoritarian, still allowed for some economic freedom, but not as much in Nazi Germany. Up here on the left, this is going to be where Stalin is located. And the Soviet Union is going to be up here. Very authoritarian, but the economy, the industries in the country are heavily regulated by the government. So that's just an example. I can send out an announcement, the link to take your own political compass test to see where you sit. But generally speaking, especially with high school students, you guys will usually be somewhere around the middle here. Here in Utah, there's a little bit of a sway to the right, a little bit down here. When I was in high school, I used to be right about here. Last time I took this, which was like a few years ago, I was kind of down here, right in the center of the y-axis. But everybody's going to have their own ideologies and responses to the questions. Okay. So more modern forms of governance when it comes to the economy and just politics in general. We have more capitalist society here in the U.S. or in the world. So capitalism is an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. So in a capitalist society, basically survival of the fittest. That's what kind of makes the United States such a I don't know, an attractive country for migrants is because under a capitalist system, you can come to this country and, you can start from nothing. You could be living out on the streets in a tent to becoming a CEO of a major company. Um, Basically, capitalism is argued to drive innovation. But at the same time, capitalism has been, responsible for increasing the wedge between the ultra wealthy and the ultra poor. Under the current form of capitalism here in the U.S., we're seeing more of a divide that we have. Uh, for example, the top 10 wealthiest people in the U.S., wealthiest Americans, have more money than the lower 98% of the country combined. So if you add up all 98% of the income of uh, residents in the United States, um, that would be less than all the income and money earned or kept by the top 10 wealthiest here. So with capitalism, it has its flaws. Um, Free market open capitalism usually results in that disparaging drive between poverty and wealth. Um, we do have some regulated forms of capitalism, like here in the U.S. Like for example, we have what's known as environmental protection. There are requirements for businesses that they have to say have safe working conditions, that you know they're taxed at a higher rate than say the average American. So there are some ways to kind of regulate capitalism, but there's not really a fine line between when it goes from capitalism to say communism. Um, but some communist states like China has started drifting more towards a capitalist system. In China now, in the last couple decades, you're able to own small businesses. Um, you still are heavily taxed by the government, um, but there are some opportunities for capitalist ventures. A lot of the elite in China um, are extremely wealthy, and as a result of having ownership of some of the state-owned companies and corporations, and also investments into U.S. businesses as well. Okay, so that brings us to federal state federation. So we're not going to spend too much time on this. We already know how a federal government's set up, but just remembering that the difference between a unitary and a federal state is that a federal state is going to be one where it is unified, but there is kind of equal balance of power between the national government and the local government. So, for example, in the United States, there's kind of an equal balance between the federal government and the state governments, and that they're each able to check back against each other. That's why, um, for example, if President-elect Biden or current President Trump wanted to enforce a mask mandate for the entire country, they're not allowed to. Because there are safeguards in place that say that it's left up to the states, because it explicitly says in the Constitution that the federal government has no authority to order uh, a mask mandate unless it's an act by Congress. Um, and so, if either president wanted to enforce a mask mandate for the entire country, they would not be allowed to. That's why only individual states are allowed to enforce that. Um, so that's just an example of how there's balance between the different factions of government within the state. If you're in a unitary state, so if, for example, Xi Jinping in China ordered a countrywide mask mandate, Putin ordered a countrywide mask mandate, they have that authority because they have a unitarian form of government. They don't really have to worry about anybody checking back against them. Now, I put Russia on here because it's technically set up to have a federal form of government, but Russia or Vladimir Putin has total absolute control over the government and has silenced his opponents in opposition. I think it was about a month or two ago, Putin's real only challenger was poisoned by a nerve agent that was also used by the Russians on a former spy in London. Basically, this opposition leader um, was on a flight from Siberia to Moscow, and they put this poison in his tea, drank this tea, and he was on the verge of death. They had to get him to Germany, where he's now like still pretty much in ICU. But that's an example of how you don't judge a book by its cover. Even though Russia claims to be very free and open government, it's ultimately Putin who is calling the shots and controlling the government. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at how some of these structures of government look like in visual form, because I can talk all about these countries and how they're set up, but sometimes it's not that easy for you guys to understand. Oops. Let me, sorry, my mouse is kind of acting out here. Okay. Sorry, I tried to get rid of this little talking thing. Let me move it up here. Okay, so we're going to look specifically at how the USSR was established, but if you want to understand what a unitary government looks like, the USSR is a fine example of a unitarian form of government that existed. So under the USSR, you can see how it's very top down, that each branch, each level responds to somebody right above them. And ultimately, it is the premier of the government who is in control and calling the shots. So in the Soviet Union, some of the famous premiers, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev, Mikhail Gorbachev. They were all premiers of the Soviet Union, and they had pretty much absolute control over the entire country. And basically, they would call out orders, and those orders would go through the system here. And what it looked like to the average Soviet citizen is like, oh, we actually can vote for these people, and except for the premier, but we vote for like the Politburo, the Secretariat, the Council of Ministers. But in reality, the Soviet Union only allowed one party to run, and they chose which candidates ran, and those were basically ordained by the Communist Party of Russia or the Soviet Union, and they would always win, because if you can only vote for one candidate in an election, is it really an election? Not so much. And so this is ultimately what a unitarian form of government looks like on the extreme side when we're looking at, say, the Soviet Union. So let's see what happened with the Soviet Union and how it came about. So Russia prior to 1917 was an absolute monarchy ruled by the Tsar. So Tsar was Nicholas II. He was the absolute ruler, had gotten Russia involved in some pretty bad conflicts. He lost the Japanese-Russian War in 1904. He tried quashing some uprisings. There was a revolution in 1905, but he met that with a lot of force. And then he got Russia involved in World War I. A lot of Russians were really upset with that. They were just tired of having an absolute ruler. There wasn't really a belief that the Tsar was a divine gift. So what ultimately happened, there was a lot of peasants. Peasantry was still practiced heavily in Russia. Peasantry is basically one step above slavery. It's similar to serfdom. And essentially, people ended up getting up, people were upset. Um, yeah, people were upset. Uh, One second here. Um, anyway, so people in Russia were upset. They wanted to overthrow the Tsar, but this is the first revolution in Russia, 1917. In February, people, started saying, "Okay, it's time to get rid of the Tsar." And so the Tsar was um, the Tsar was removed from the throne, exiled, no longer in power. So there was a provisional government that was put in place um, that was trying to transition Russia from an absolute monarchy to potentially a constitutional monarchy or a form of democracy. But that government was kind of failing. There wasn't really strong leadership, and we had a lot of uproar the um, in the Russian um, in the Russian factories in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Meanwhile, we have communist fervor spreading throughout Europe, and we have an exiled Russian, Vladimir Lenin, who was exiled by the Tsar. He is in Germany, and Germany's like, "Oh, let's get Russia out of the war, so we're going to send Lenin to Russia to lead a communist revolution." And so they send Lenin with a bunch of gold and money to Russia. And in October 1917, the Bolsheviks, who are the um, basically communist revolutionaries, overthrow the provisional government. They storm the Winter Palace, and the provisional government fails. And the Bolsheviks, the communists, take over and establish the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Their first act was to get out of World War I, and they start focusing on building a communist state within the former Russian Empire. Now, this was a unitarian state established under Lenin, even though Lenin did not want to establish a Unitarian form of government. Under Karl Marx, his vision was not a Unitarian form of government. Under communism, ultimately, Lenin wanted the Soviet Union to go more away from one or two rulers to being ruled by what's known as the proletariat. Proletariat were the working class, the people working in the factories, and even working on the farms in Russia. And so ultimately, Lenin wanted those people to end up leading the country. That was his vision. He knew that it was not going to be easy going from an absolute monarch to letting the people rule. And so that's why Lenin was kind of considered the leader of the Soviet Union for a while. But Lenin ends up dying in 1924 from a stroke, and his vision is kind of ignored. And eventually, Joseph Stalin comes into power, and he assumes leadership and says, "Okay, Well, Lenin wasn't really on the right path. I believe that the way to build Soviet Union into a strong industrial country is to consolidate power and to get rid of any opposition to um, the buildup of our great nation and to prepare us for the inevitable war with Germany. Because once Hitler gets um, into power in 1933 in Germany, Stalin knows that there's going to be an inevitable war with Germany because in Hitler's Mein Kampf, he really talks about how um, the Russians, the Bolsheviks, the Slavs are um, well, basically, it's the Judeo-Bolshevik state, that the Soviet Union is run completely by Jews, and that the Jews are going to take over the world through communism, and so we must fight back against communism. That was Hitler's ideology. Even though the rest of the world didn't really pay attention to it, Stalin did. He actually kept his own personal copy of Mein Kampf in his study, and he actually wrote, it's in German because Stalin could read German, but he also wrote notes in Russian because he knew that that was going to be Hitler's end goal. So he built up the Soviet Union in industrially, agriculturally, and militarily to prepare for the war. Now, under Stalin, a lot of bad things happened. Millions of people died either of starvation or being killed at the hands of the government. But historians will argue that had it not been for Stalin, there's a good chance that the world would be speaking German today, because without the Soviet Union and its fight against Nazi Germany, the Allies most likely wouldn't have had a chance against the army of the Nazis. So once again, Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, is a great example of a unitarian state. Basically, Stalin purged, got rid of every single opposition or enemy of his rule, and established a total communist totalitarian state and assumed complete control. Top-down system. Basically, whatever Stalin said was what ultimately would happen. He created some organizations that were all his buddies and people he trusted, that made it appear as though he's allowing for more say in the government, but in reality, everybody in those central committees, Politburo, and the General Secretary um, were all in line with his ideology and his beliefs. Then it ended up changing a little bit. So after Stalin dies in 1950, we have um, the establishment of a more traditional Soviet Union, and we have still a very top-down system, but it's not as top-down. There's still a lot more say by the people down here, and even though the premier is the absolute ruler of the Soviet Union, um, if they do something really unpopular, they can be ousted. So these people down here, these leaders can actually vote to remove the premier. Under Stalin, that wasn't established. Still a unitarian form of government. Another example, we have the People's Republic of China. Civil War, as we know, 1927 1945. The communist movement led by Mao Zedong, inspired by the revolution in the Soviet Union in Russia. After World War II, Republic of China was defeated by the communists and Mao Zedong. We had the formation of a communist state in China. It's a little bit different, but once again, this is a great example of what a unitarian government looks like. In China, we still have the premier as the kind of absolute ruler, but there are ways of checking back against that. So the chairman is what Mao Zedong was when he first established the People's Republic of China. But nowadays, the premier actually has a bit more leadership and more power than the chairman. But these are all all these positions. If you get the right people in these positions and you're the premier, you basically can rule with absolute authority, which is what Xi Jinping today is doing. He has appointed people on these committees and positions that align with him. And if you disagree with Xi Jinping, there's a good chance you're going to get imprisoned or worse, face execution. And then obviously it's a top-down system moving down, and then you see how the citizens are at the bottom, and they don't really have that much of a say in the formulation of the government. Now, we've been talking about communist systems and how that looks like with a unitarian form of government, but it would be travesty if we didn't look at the United Kingdom and how the United Kingdom looks like as a unitarian form of government. So thinking about how United Kingdom was an absolute monarchy until about the 1600s, that's when we have the establishment of a constitutional monarchy where we actually have a parliament and that the monarchy has to share power with the people, the quote unquote people. And so there's more checking back against the monarchy, but yet the monarchy still has power, even though that power kind of diminished over the centuries. But today, Parliament has most of the power in Parliament. They use a lower house, the House of Commons, which is elected by the people. And then you have the upper house, which is the House of Lords, which is elected by, or which is appointed by either the monarchy or Parliament. And they're usually consisted of religious leaders, bishops of the Church of England, nobility. So, you know, knights and, nobility that have been appointed by the monarchy, and then specific positions appointed by Parliament. So this is what it ultimately looks like. So this is Her Majesty's government. So the Queen or King, so currently Queen Elizabeth II has the authority and duty to establish a government. So usually if there is a majority of one party in Parliament, the Queen will select the Prime Minister and task the Prime Minister with establishing a government that can actually be effective. So this is just an example. So this is looking at some of the ministries within the government, but you can see how it's very top down, and that if your section of government, so if you're talking about whether that's the Secretary of State for Energy, if you're talking about the Secretary of Defense, Ministry of Defense, you basically have to respond to Parliament when it comes to those positions. That there isn't really any balance between the government. It's a very top-down system. Once again, we see not a lot of input or say coming from the bottom. Even though the United Kingdom very much emphasizes democracy, kind of one of the founding fathers of democracy, it's not as widely practiced. It's not an open form of democracy as say we have here in the United States. Okay, versus federal states, which if we look at, you guys obviously know this by now. We've talked about it a lot. 3 branches of power typically in a federal state like the United States: executive, judicial, and legislative. This is how it looks like, and you see how there are 3 branches and they all have equal law or equal authority, ability to enforce and interpret laws, and then how they each check back against each other, and that there is a system in place to balance the power, that not one person or one branch has absolute rule or authority over the government or the country. So let's look at how the Russian Federation is set up. So the Russian Federation is ideally, in theory, a federal state, established their constitution June 21st of 1994, though they declared their sovereignty from the Soviet Union in 1991. We'll talk about how the Soviet Union, even though we think of it as Russia, the Soviet Union was comprised of several different states, and the formal USSR included the Russian Soviet state, Ukrainian Soviet state, the Belarusian Soviet state, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia. Those are all Soviet states that made up the Soviet Union. And so Russia, the Russian state, the Russian Soviet Republic, declared independence from the Soviet Union in December of 1991. So ultimately, what happened was once all these countries left the Soviet Union was a stateless country. And Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of a stateless country. But we'll talk about how Soviet Union ended up breaking down with the devolution section. So the first president of Russia, the Russian Federation, was Boris Yeltsin. He led this movement during the Soviet Union and then allowed for the sovereignty of Russia from the Soviet Union. He was notorious for being a outward open drunk. He would usually engage in speeches when he was very intoxicated. Not a great leader, first president of Russia, and he ultimately sold out a lot of the corporations and companies in Russia to Western American companies, and only allowed for a few Russians to actually hold control of those countries. We call them oligarchs. But Boris tried to create a government, a country that mimicked the United States. So ultimately, the Constitution of the Russian Federation is the governing document and the go-to when it comes to any conflicts within the government. We have the constitutional courts and the head of state, so the president, they share power and are supposed to check back against each other. And then, as you see, it looks like it's a top-down system, but each of these branches can really kind of check against each other. Same with chairman and deputy chairman with the constitutional courts. So outwardly, this appears like a federal form of government, even though it doesn't have a legislative branch necessarily on equal terms. They have a judicial and executive branch that are in check with each other. But the problem is that if you get somebody like Putin, who has stacked the court system and put basically killed off or incarcerated any enemies on this court system and put in people who are going to agree with you, then it doesn't really matter if you have this form of government in place. So even though Russia appears to be a federal form of government, federal state, it is turning out to be more so a unitarian form of government. All right, so that's going to take us up for class. Gets me right to where I wanted to. What we're going to do on Thursday, we're going to start talking about how states start falling apart. So how unitarian or federal states end up dissolving and falling apart. We'll start out looking specifically at the end of the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Then we're going to start looking at challenges to state sovereignty, specifically the European Union, United Nations. So on Thursday, we're going to get into the depths of the United Nations, but does anybody have any questions about political ideologies or the makeup of unitarian or federal states? All right, if nobody has any questions right away for the class, at this point, you are free to leave the Zoom. Thank you guys for being here and being in class today. And I will see you guys in class on Thursday. And then distance learners, look out for a video, hopefully Thursday afternoon, evening. But best of luck to everybody. See you on Thursday.
Thank you.